Um, Thanks so much for being here, guys. Naeshia and I are going to kind of go back and forth a little bit. I'm going to get everybody started just with an opener of human trafficking and specifically the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So this is, I would say, an excerpt of a longer training that was developed between a partnership with the Georgia Center for Child Advocacy and the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia. We do have a handout that goes along with this. Jill, is that something that can be sent out to our participants after the presentation today?
Yeah, we can send it out after and also put on the website if you guys are okay with that.
Great. Okay, so it will provide you all with just, I know a lot of people always ask about having the slides. So this handout will be a great representation of the presentation today. And we'll touch on the highlights of the presentation and also provide some resources for you guys. So just a little bit about myself, Tiffany Sawyer. As Jill said, I'm the Director of Prevention and Education at the Georgia Center for Child Advocacy. I see a lot of familiar names, which is wonderful, and I'm glad we have a good representation from across the state. For those of you that are not aware, the Georgia Center for Child Advocacy, we are a singular child advocacy center serving children who have been sexually or severely physically abused in DeKalb and Fulton counties. So we provide direct services for youth and their families in those two counties. However, where we're slightly different from other child advocacy centers is that we have a statewide abuse prevention initiative, working with lots of other organizations across the state to bring education, awareness, and resources to adults and to youth. So we are excited to partner with CACGA, the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia, and specifically with Naeshia, my co-presenter today, because they serve as the central point of contact for victims of commercial sexual exploitation. And they work with agencies that support youth to provide a more coordinated and effective system response to commercial sexual exploitation. So I'm super excited to have Naeshia here. Naeshia, do you want to just give a quick introduction before we jump in?
Sure. Again, my name is Naeshia McDowell. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Tiffany, for the warm introduction. But as she said, we're so happy to partner with Georgia Center for Child Advocacy to develop this training. And our organization serves as sort of an umbrella organization for our over 50 child advocacy centers throughout the state of Georgia. And basically, our child advocacy centers are that central point of contact in their communities for children that have experienced any type of abuse or neglect or have witnessed any type of crime. So super excited to have them at the table. They are also the foundation of our response to child sex trafficking in the state of Georgia. And of course, the Georgia Center has been—
Well, mine got messed up on the end, but you can't tell because
and the Georgia Center has been a leader in this work for a very long time now. So this has been a partnership that has been in the works for some time, and we're excited to bring you this presentation today. So please let us know if you have any questions in the chat, and we'll definitely try to get to those.
Yep, Naeshia and Jill are going to be paying attention to the chat while I am presenting, and then I'll take over when Naeshia jumps in for her piece. So before we get started, we are going to be asking you all to participate in the chat some. We may even have some of you come off mute and share a little bit more about what you've put into the chat. So just know that we may be calling on you for something like that. So because you are participating and we want to hear from you, we believe that connection and learning from others happens when people from diverse backgrounds and perspectives come together. So we welcome diverse and inclusive interactions and comments from all of our participants in the chat, or if you're coming off mute. So we ask that when you're participating, please be respectful of others when commenting in the class or sharing some comments in the chat box. Racism, discrimination, microaggressions, hate in any form will not be tolerated. So we just like to go ahead and say that. So if you have concerns about anything regarding the chat or something that's posted in there, please let us know with a private message. So I appreciate that. as we get started. All right. So let's review the learning objectives today, the things that we're going to go over. We will hope to increase your understanding of CSEC and human trafficking, increase your knowledge of the prevalence here in Georgia, what it looks like here in Georgia. Hopefully you will understand the trauma, abuse, and victimization associated with commercial sexual exploitation and that impact that it has on victims and survivors. You'll become familiar with warning signs that trafficking victims might display. We hope to increase your knowledge of some community resources. So we're going to talk a little bit about that victim response. And then also learn how to get involved in the fight against commercial sexual exploitation. So we want you to get involved because there is something that all of us can do to prevent and get involved. So we're going to be using some terminology today that might be difficult for some of us to hear. So it's possible that some of you have a connection to commercial sexual exploitation. Maybe you know someone personally who's been impacted by CSEC. It's really important to be aware of the emotions that can stir up from talking about this subject and other traumatic situations. So it's important to take care of yourself. I want you to think for a moment and consider who you might reach out to for support in the event that some of the content today brings up some emotions for you either during the workshop or after the workshop. I just want you to be aware of who you can reach out to. And Naeshia and I will also be sharing our contact information at the end. So if you have any follow-up questions or something that you wanted to chat with us about, we would be happy to answer any of those questions. All right. So this first activity was designed to really break the ice as we begin to talk about a difficult subject. So I really want to set the stage here to help everyone think about, be in the mindset of what someone might be experiencing if they are going through commercial sexual exploitation. So I'm going to read some statements, and I want you to just let these statements sink in for a minute, okay? Imagine constantly having to lie about your age. Imagine having all of your identification taken away from you. Imagine having to change your name. Imagine feeling trapped in an abusive and violent situation. Imagine being raped repeatedly. Imagine having to give all of the money you earn to someone else. Imagine being beaten for not making enough money. Imagine having sex with strangers every single night. Imagine getting an STD. Imagine being arrested several times. Imagine having to call a man who abuses you and is not your father, daddy. So the purpose of this activity is to really set the tone for today's training and to get a glimpse of the impact that it has on victims. And of course, not every victim story is exactly the same. We take these statements from a variety of stories because we know everybody's experience is slightly different, although that there are some commonalities. So I know that is really heavy and a lot to hear, especially at the beginning of the training, but we feel like it's really important to understand the significance of what children experience with commercial sexual exploitation and to get into that mindset. So those particular types of feelings and scenarios that I just described are things that kids that are served every day experience on a regular basis. So I just want to say I appreciate your willingness to be here to talk about this issue, to learn more, because we can have a much more robust response to this issue when we know what we're dealing with and when everybody can be at the table to try to address the issue. All right, So this training is divided into 4 parts. So first is the issue itself, where I'm going to give you some definitions, talk a little bit about who is impacted and what it looks like. We'll also talk briefly about the responses here, especially here in Georgia. And then lastly, we'll talk about prevention, as Jill mentioned, because we want to make sure that we can do whatever we can to prevent this from ever happening to a child, or to decrease the likelihood that youth will be trafficked. So in this section, in part 1, with the issue, we're going to create a foundational knowledge. So within this portion, we will talk about what commercial sexual exploitation of children is, where and how it is happening, and why it is important to change our language, the language that we use when we're talking about it. All right, so I'm going to begin with sharing some data about commercial sexual exploitation. So it's important to recognize that the average age of entry, so meaning the average age that a child would begin to be trafficked within commercial sexual exploitation, is 12 to 14 years old. So you see here on the screen, 12 to 14 years old is the average age of entry. There are frequently cited statistics about the number of juveniles who are being trafficked in the United States. They're kind of all over the board. So we hear numbers like 300,000 children, 100,000 children. Those are numbers that are pretty widely used. However, if we look closely, these estimates reveal that none are really based on scientific foundation. They're merely guesses or extrapolations based on some questionable assumptions. And the reality is that there is currently no reliable estimate of how many juveniles are being trafficked in the United States. We do know that in 2020, some data that was gathered from the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is operated by Polaris. Some of you may have heard of Polaris as a resource. They revealed that nationwide, 16,658 victims of human trafficking were identified. And of that 16,600, almost 11,000 of those were trafficked for sex, and about 3,500 were trafficked for labor, and a little over 600 were trafficked for both sex and labor. So I want to share, though, that this data should not be mistaken for the prevalence of human trafficking in the United States over a given year. The data only reflects contacts to the trafficking hotline. So we know that each situation is unique. So are the questions that are answered or the answers that are recorded. So it's really impossible to know how many other situations of trafficking are going on or exploitation are occurring that are never reported, that never come to the trafficking hotline, but that does give us a tiny glimpse in what we are experiencing nationwide. So I just want to always share that you may hear numbers thrown around about the prevalence of human trafficking in the United States. And if we look at that scientific foundation, there aren't really great reliable estimates for that. What we do know more clearly is what is happening here in Georgia. So in 2021 in Georgia, 494 youth were served by members of the statewide commercial sexual exploitation response team. The Metro Atlanta region encounters a large number of children who are at risk or victimized by commercial sexual exploitation. However, when we view these numbers of children who are at risk or confirmed per county population, so if you base that, the number that were served or the number that were at risk by the county population, you tend to see that rural regions are pretty comparable to Metro Atlanta. So if you look at this, this state map here and you see where CSEC referrals were received, you recognize that this is not just an Atlanta issue. This is a state of Georgia issue where kids are being trafficked, exploited in lots of different counties throughout Georgia and throughout the United States. If we look at this a little bit more deeply, you can see a graph here of the age breakdown of the youth that were served. So as you can see in the graph, the local data is really in line with that national data, that the average age of youth that were served was 14 years old. If you look there, 273 served between the ages of 10 and 15. And this shows us that, again, it's in line with that national data, that the average age of entry is 12 to 14 years old. So I'm going to let you just take a look at that for a second. I always like to really look in at graphs. It takes me a second to just realize what I'm looking at, all of the data here. And then I want to go on to the next one. So here is the breakdown of youth served by race and ethnicity. And again, I'm just going to give you a quiet few seconds to take a look at those numbers there and percentages. Okay, and then next, here's the breakdown of youth served by gender. As you can see, females are exploited, the numbers here in Georgia, at a much higher rate than males or other genders. So what surprises you by these numbers, these graphs that I just shared? Are there any surprises that you guys had as I was sharing some of these, or just the counties that are covered? You can type something into the chat if you have any thoughts about what we're seeing here in Georgia out of the 494 children that were served. Yeah, so the large area of coverage in the state. Absolutely, right? People tend to think it's a city issue. Yep, so I'm pretty sure that the number of males is much higher. I know the reporting is lower for them. Absolutely, we know that there's a huge stigma and taboo that goes along with this. So the reporting and just, you know, the way that kids are able to get out of trafficking is very difficult for them. So that number is probably really much higher. I definitely think that the numbers excluding women are underreported for sure. All right. Okay, I am going to keep going. Let's see. No, I think there was another question. Do you have a number of calls that come through the hotline in a year in relation to the numbers that you gave on the stats? I can put the reference for you in the chat. Once Naeshia starts speaking, I can put the reference for you of where that came from Polaris, so that you guys can see the number of calls in relation to what was reported there. Great question. All right. So we're going to do a fact versus myth activity to see how much you guys already know about human trafficking and child sex trafficking. So I am going to read a statement out loud, and I want you to type into the chat whether you think the statement is a myth or a fact, and any thoughts that you have around that myth or fact. Okay, so first, victims are usually kidnapped and held against their will. What do you guys think? All right, I'm seeing, thank you, Naeshia, for sharing the link. I'm seeing lots of myths, one or two facts, few facts, myths, facts. All right, great, thank you. Thanks so much. So, how many of you seen the movie Taken? Lots of people. I think that the movie Taken has really misled a lot of people to think that, you know, this version of trafficking where somebody is kidnapped, there's some kind of heist, you know, where that version of trafficking is very common. despite how rarely victims are kidnapped by, you know, the bad guys in a scary van. So this is a myth. Most victims are recruited and groomed either online or in person. And by grooming them, traffickers are able to build a relationship with the child, again, either online or in person. They might make them think that they're being promised something. They might think that they are in a relationship with the trafficker. There's a lot of different grooming tactics that we'll talk about a little bit later. And this allows the trafficker to build trust and earn the trust of the child. And so most of the time, children are not kidnapped and held against their will. So that is a myth. All right, next one. Children in the commercial sex industry are bad kids. Myth or fact? Myth. All right. Yeah, I better see myth on everyone for this one. That's great. So I don't ever want to think of kids as being bad, right? Bad. Many of the children and youth that we work with have experienced bad circumstances, or they have been forced to make bad choices. Think about the lesser of two evils: do this or be beaten. Do this or something's going to happen to your family. Or they've been told that law enforcement is bad and they're going to be arrested and all of these horrible things are going to happen to them. So they, listen to what the trafficker said. So because they've had to make bad choices and forced to make those bad choices, it doesn't mean that they are inherently bad kids and that they want this, that they're actively choosing this as the best option for them. And we'll actually talk about that in a little bit. All right, youth make good money in the sex industry. What do you guys think? It's a really lucrative business. So what do you guys think? All right, somebody that's saying myth. Why do you think it's a myth? They make money for their pimps. Okay, thank you, Stephanie. So we're going to talk about language in just a second. So yep, the youth don't keep the money. That's right. Yeah, so the issue here is not necessarily about the money earned, but where the money goes, right? So all of you guys did a great job in answering this. So yeah, it's a profitable industry for traffickers because kids are a commodity that can be used over and over and over and over again. Unlike drugs, unlike arms, you sell drugs, the drugs are gone. You sell children and you can use that commodity over and over and over again. However, kids are not seeing this money, or at least they're not keeping it. They might be collecting it, but they're not keeping that money. So there was a client that said that her trafficker allowed her to keep all of the money that she made, that he put it into a bank account for her. And when she was asked a little bit more about the money, the bank that was used, whether she had a debit card, how she could access it, it became really clear that she didn't have access to any of that money. So she thought that she was getting to keep that money, but in fact, the trafficker was controlling her access to it. So she didn't actually have access to it. So even kids who are engaged in survival sex, which is something that we're going to talk about, they may be making good money, but the money is typically used to take care of themselves. So it's survival sex for a reason, right? To survive. So that money is going for food, clothing, shelter, or their families. So thank you for engaging in that with me. All right. Being in the life is exciting. It's glamorous. What do you guys think? Myth.
In the car. So of course my sisters are freaking out then. She had to throw.
All right, great. Everybody says myth. So we're going to actually hear from a survivor. I'm going to share a video with you guys. Her name is Rachel Lloyd, a little bit later in the training. So she's going to talk about the initial allure of having nice things, you know, especially when your basic needs haven't always been met for the rest of your life. That positive attention, going out to clubs, you know, feeling special, that initially can seem really exciting for kids, especially if you haven't been receiving any kind of attention earlier in life. But the reality is that the glamorous lifestyle that kids think that they're getting is very short-lived, might only be at the very beginning, and quickly it becomes very dangerous and demeaning. All right, 2 more. Children in the industry just like to have sex. Thank you for everybody saying myth on that. So this can be tricky because just like with child sexual abuse, there is the possibility that kids might have a natural biological response to touch, including pleasure, right? Sex is made to be pleasurable. We want that to be pleasing. So our natural biological reaction when it is a sexual touch oftentimes is a feeling of pleasure. However, think about how confusing that might be for a child who is feeling that in the very moment, that pleasure of it, and yet is someone, you know, they're feeling hurt and scared by the entire experience. They might also be beaten afterwards or when they get back. So there's a lot of confusing pieces to this, and it makes it much more complex than, you know, than just children feeling like they just want to have sex. So I'm so glad that everybody said myth, but there is a complex piece to that. All right, last one. Youth who are trafficked always identify as victims. All right, I think you guys are catching on that all of these are myths. So youth very rarely identify as victims. Oftentimes they have a trauma bond with their trafficker, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And that means that they consider their trafficker to be someone who takes care of them. Sometimes they're in the role of a boyfriend or father figure, or that's, you know, sometimes for the female identifying victims. So, you know, they wouldn't use the word victim in that case, right? Because this person is their boyfriend or their father figure. So others simply haven't had any other experience than people taking advantage of them or using them for sex. They might have previously experienced child sexual abuse at home. And so their self-worth is, you know, tied up in all of that. So it becomes who they are, and they don't see themselves as victims. They just see themselves as, this is just what's been happening to me my whole life. And this is my self-worth. This is who I am and what I'm used for. So they don't really have the capacity to think about their situation from the outside, that what's actually happening to them is victimization. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Thank you guys so much for participating in that. All right, so you see here that human trafficking is an umbrella term. All right, so it's the umbrella term. So it encompasses both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And there are many different definitions for these terms. During this training today, these are the definitions that we are going to use that you see here. So human trafficking is a crime that involves exploiting a person for labor, for services, or commercial sex. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, slavery, those kinds of things. So examples of how this can occur are things like agricultural work, domestic servitude, things like housekeepers or nannies forced to do that work, forced labor in sweatshops, being forced to work in an adult entertainment or dancing industry, forced to do massage, those kinds of things. That would all be included within labor trafficking. For sex trafficking, it is any sex act in which something of value, and it doesn't necessarily have to be money. So something of value could be money, food, shelter, could be drugs and or alcohol, could be clothing, could be a ride. I really need a ride. So something of value is exchanged or given or received by any person. Again, force, fraud, or coercion, unless the person is under the age of 18. So force, fraud, or coercion have to be in place to be able to prove sex trafficking, unless the person is under the age of 18. When sex trafficking involves someone under 18, it is referred to as commercial sexual exploitation. So you see the arrow there, commercial sexual exploitation, or we call it CSEC for short. That is underneath sex trafficking because that is specifically for people under the age of 18. So an example of how what this might include is, again, could be within the adult entertainment industry. So those are a little bit overlapping. Even massage, where there are sexual favors and things like that, that's a little bit overlapping between labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And then a buyer who might come to a child to receive a sex act. So if we look at defining CSEC specifically, you might also hear child sex trafficking. You may also hear domestic minor sex trafficking. That refers to victims who are within the United States, they're domestic. It is the sexual abuse of a child by another person in exchange for something of value. So that's what makes it a commercial sex act, because there's that exchange of something of value. So regardless of consent, anyone under the age of 18 who has performed a sex act of any kind, or who has provided photos or videos, sexual photos, nude videos, things like that, in exchange for something of value, is a victim of commercial sexual exploitation or sex trafficking, and they are not a child prostitute. We should not even be using those two words together, child and prostitute. So under the mandatory reporting child abuse law, CSEC is a form of child abuse in the state of Georgia, and it is required to be reported. So super, super important. All right. So now that we've defined human trafficking as a whole, I want us to talk a little bit about where and how trafficking occurs. So take a look at these images that you see here. All right, we've got something that looks like a classroom, something that looks like a neighborhood, a massage parlor. We've got a group of guys hanging out together, a laptop, and then we've got somebody that looks like they are experiencing homelessness. So does it surprise you that human trafficking occurs right out in the open in these public places? And these images are shown to help illustrate the prevalence of the problem, because again, a lot of times it happens right out in the open under people's noses, and we don't know that it's actually occurring. So if we look at trafficker facilitated, traffickers target vulnerable children or young adults and lure them into sex trafficking. Sometimes they will manipulate them psychologically. Sometimes they will use drugs or alcohol to get them addicted to drugs. And then, you know, now that they're addicted, I'm going to lure them in by, you can have this as long as you engage in this sex act. Sometimes they manipulate them through violence, or as I said before, pretending to be a boyfriend or a really close girlfriend. So that happens pretty frequently, that traffickers are facilitating this engagement where they're luring them in a variety of ways. If you look at gang facilitated, in gang controlled trafficking, youth may be exploited as the initiation. So this is how they engage in the gang itself, or they might do this to bring in revenue for the gang. And gangs often perceive sex trafficking as less risky than trafficking drugs and trafficking arms and weapons. So they view it as a pretty lucrative market. And so you'll see a lot of gang activity associated with sex trafficking. With technology facilitated trafficking, youth exploitation is facilitated through lots of times social media. So, it might be through sextortion, where somebody is, asking a child, pretending to be a youth themselves, and then engaging in conversation, and then asking the child to do several things, asking the child to meet up, and then it can be facilitated through that. So there may not be a trafficker involved in facilitating the exploitation. It could be a third party, it could be a buyer. So, it could be, as I said, a youth engaging in sexually suggestive or nude images for money. They might be posting that. There's lots of different ways through technology that youth can be trafficked. Through businesses, businesses that facilitate or profit from, or they might even be turning a blind eye to trafficking. That could be something like a massage parlor that you see here, a spa, an escort service, adult entertainment clubs, could even be hotels where they are turning a blind eye. They may have an arrangement with some traffickers to be able to use the hotel for sex exchange. One that people don't often think about is family facilitated. And this occurs, and there is a whole level of added vulnerability that comes with family facilitated trafficking. So this occurs when a family member exchanges sexual acts with a child for, it could be money, it could be to pay the rent, it could be to pay, the electric bill, other kinds of things. It could be for drugs or other substances, or it could be even status within the community. And family members could include, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. It really could be a variety of people within the family that are using children in exchange for sex and money. And then lastly, survival sex. This includes any sexual act exchanged for an extreme need. So, sex for money, sex for shelter, being in extreme need for food, for money, for shelter, for, a place to call your own. Oftentimes these victims are in a desperate situation where they feel that they have no other option than to trade a sexual act, trade their body for these basic necessities in order to survive. And that is why we call it survival sex. And they may be out on the street, or they may be, couch surfing to try to find a place to be safe and to live. All right, so I am going to show a video describing a trafficker facilitated situation. So as we watch this, I want you to think about, whether you would know what to look for or how to help in this situation.
Thirsty? Is that why you're doing that? You thirsty?
Sasha Ray was born and raised in Florida. By the time she was 14, she was constantly being teased at school.
What I got picked on a lot about was being black, like really, really dark skin, I guess.
She felt alone, at home and at school. Sasha Ray says that's why, when an older classmate offered friendship, she jumped at it.
I thought she was like my best friend because I could like tell her anything. One
Day she asked if, want to skip school, we're gonna have fun. So we went to this barber shop. When I was there, she introduced me to these guys.
Sasha Ray's new friend had just led her to the man who would eventually become her trafficker.
They talked about how we was gonna make money, how it was gonna be easy, we didn't have to depend on nobody. And it was all sounding good and stuff, so I fell for it.
Was there any kind of grooming process, like when this first started? Or it's just something that just happened and he was just expecting you to learn on the way?
He slowly brought it on when we got closer, when he felt like he got closer to me. He usually did it out of the back of the barber shop. And he even had people that work with the post office, mailman come in. Mailman came in and paid their money to him, came back there to me.
All right, so you guys can see how easily children are manipulated. It seemed like it happened pretty quick for her, and she was quickly recruited into human trafficking, and it's happening out of a barber shop. So as we move through this training, we're going to talk about what you guys can do to help within these situations, because it feels pretty scary when you're not involved. Oops, sorry guys. All right, so we've already talked about the fact that being in the life is not glamorous, not exciting. So it's important that we use language that describes the actual experience that children are having and call it what it is. We've talked about how trafficking occurs and where it occurs. So I want to talk about this, considering this language and making sure that we're being sensitive. So when you see the words on the left, I imagine you immediately have a picture in your head of a person, right? What do they look like? So when you see the word pimp, what do you guys think about? And you can just type in the chat. What picture is coming to your mind when you think about a pimp? How else do we use that word in society? We hear that, word a lot, pimping your ride. Yeah, I see flashy, having control. There's like an image that we have in our head of being a pimp. There's, a high roller. I see that. Great. So there's even Halloween is coming up. There are Halloween costumes where there's pimp, right? And people and children can even dress up as a pimp. It is glamorized. And so that is not the word that we want to use when we're describing somebody that is using a child for sex and keeping all of that money, that is raping a child, that is turning them out every single night. That is not the word that we want to use. We want to call it what it is, which is a trafficker, somebody that, that should be held accountable for the sexual abuse of a child. Think about John. Anybody's name could be John, right? We don't want to call buyers John. That makes it seem like they're not criminals, that they're not exploiting children. So we need to be calling them buyers. Otherwise, it's blameless. Anybody can be named John, right? They don't have, there's a lack of accountability there. And then I would say probably the most important one, the term child prostitute. Again, those two words should not ever go together. Are you, less sympathetic when you say the words, when you hear the words child prostitute versus victim or survivor of commercial sexual exploitation? So we need to change our language because it reframes the issue as a form of child abuse, what it is. It expresses the philosophy that sexually exploited children deserve support and services instead of jail sentences. They should not be put away for experiencing CSEC. It more accurately represents the scope of the issue and the reality of what a child experiences, and it creates a common language for us to all talk about this and be able to provide support and prevention services. However, if we hear survivors or victims using this terminology that you see in yellow or orange, whatever colors that looks like to you, we don't ever want to tell a survivor or a victim that they are using wrong language. So we as the supporters, we as the people within the system that are helping, we need to use the correct language, but we never want to accuse a survivor or a victim of using the wrong language because that is their experience. All right, I am going to turn it over to Naeshia to take us through the impact.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tiffany. So now that we've talked about or sort of gained a working knowledge of the issue of human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children, now we're going to take a look at who's impacted and how they're impacted by the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So the first issue that we're going to focus on is the connection between child maltreatment and trauma and CSEC. And remember, we're using the acronym CSEC, which stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. So there's a profound connection between all of these issues. And so one of which is a study revealed that 70% of a population of sexually exploited minors had experienced multiple episodes of maltreatment, such as trauma and other chronic conditions during their childhood. And so polyvictimization, when we think about the grand scope of it, it refers to experiences of multiple victimizations of different kinds, not just multiple episodes. And so those multiple victimizations can include a person reporting physical abuse in childhood. And for example, if a child reports any type of physical abuse in childhood, they are 6 times more likely to experience sexual abuse and 11 times more likely to witness domestic violence. So it is an understatement to note that CSEC, or commercially sexually exploited youth, experience significant polyvictimization. And Tiffany talked about it a little bit earlier. Some of our youth are not only being raped every night, but they're also being physically abused, emotionally manipulated. There may be some neglect or abandonment by family members. And so there can be several victimizations that are co-occurring at the same time. Research shows that these youth may experience more than 4 to 7 victimizations in 1 year. So think about the impact that this has on this child's ongoing development and just how they see themselves. So this is why we focus on primary prevention and why it's so important. Child maltreatment and CSEC are preventable. Similarly, when we make a report of abuse, we could be preventing other forms of violence and future violence. And everyone on this call is a mandated reporter, so we should certainly be doing all that we can to make sure we're preventing and addressing any ongoing abuse and neglect. All right, so to sort of add on to that, what we're going to show you now is the continuum of sexual abuse and commercial sexual exploitation. So you see we have this continuum listed here on the screen, and being a victim of sexual abuse in particular is a risk factor for CSEC. So let's review some of the patterns that are created as a result of some unresolved child sexual abuse, such as failure of trust, keeping secrets, viewing yourself or a child viewing themselves as a sexual object, some blurred boundaries, linking sex and love, maybe even acting out. And these all can lead to some vulnerabilities for commercial sexual exploitation. For some victims of sexual abuse, their feelings of helplessness, anger, hopelessness stem from not having the intervention or the protective adults in their life. And this can lead to a sense of complacency, to just endure what is happening to them. This can also lead to the need to run away from the home or run away from the abuse, in turn creating the need for money, food, shelter, leaving them vulnerable to a trafficker. And Tiffany spoke to this earlier. When our youth are simply trying to survive, they may often engage in survival sex. And lastly, media and businesses showing children as sex objects or presenting children in a way that entices adults gives permission to think of children as sexual and normalizes the behavior. So there are so many examples of people that people may identify when they think of this. So children in sexy ads, strip clubs, for business meetings, pornography, that they all contribute to the CSEC industry. And this normalization feeds more demand because people become immune to it or no longer see it as harmful or bad. So just to give you sort of an overall view of how sexual abuse in particular can lead to commercial sexual exploitation, national statistics indicate that 70 to 90% of sexually abused or sexually exploited children have a history of child sexual abuse. And so those numbers are national, but I will tell you that our statistics here in Georgia are basically in line with those national statistics. Overwhelmingly, we see that many of the kids that are referred to our organization due to exploitation have a history of some form of child sexual abuse. And often there is that factor of polyvictimization. Maybe they experienced neglect, they witnessed domestic violence, maybe they even witnessed crime. So this is consistent with our Georgia data as well. So next, we are going to share a video with you called The Making of a Girl. And this video demonstrates the continuum and the patterns that are created by unaddressed child sexual abuse, which eventually leads to commercial sexual exploitation. So as you follow along with Rachel Lloyd, and Rachel Lloyd is a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation herself, and she leads an organization called Girls Education Mentoring, which provides services to youth that are at risk for and victims of commercial sexual exploitation in New York City. So throughout the video, Rachel will mention several vulnerabilities. So if you don't mind jotting those down, we'll talk about a few of them after the video.
You know, you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are, and you know how pretty your hair looks, and it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at, and he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And so that night, he takes you to a club, and he puts you up on the stage, and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead, baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy, and you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night, he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room, and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do, and yet there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 cents, and he takes you to McDonald's, and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made. And right now, you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
like this is the best that it's ever gonna get, and everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment. All the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it will be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you'll do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac and you're eating McDonald's and you're listening to 50 and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
So that's an eye-opening video that speaks to some of the experiences that our youth that are impacted by CSEC experience and have. And so what we're going to do now is discuss a few vulnerabilities. And if you could, as we take a look at the vulnerability slide, I want you to put in the chat any vulnerabilities that stood out to you while Rachel was speaking. So if you could just drop in the chat as you're looking at some of these vulnerabilities on the screen, any that you identified through Rachel's conversation. Previous sexual abuse, absolutely. A history of sexual abuse, low self-worth, linking sex with love, past victimization, even poly-victimization. So she talked about a few different things. Neglect seemed to be an issue, even basic hunger, not having access to basic needs. Feeling alone and needing a void to be filled, right? So when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, love and acceptance are just a basic need, and our kids are searching for that. So having that abuse history, absolutely. So all of the vulnerabilities that we have listed here are just the tip of the iceberg, right? I'm sure we could all come up with additional ones, but when we think about a vulnerability is not a weakness. It's simply something about us, something about you, something about me that someone may choose to use or exploit or take advantage of. It's something that makes a person an easier target for exploitation and something that increases one's likelihood of being harmed. And the stage of adolescence creates a vulnerability, right? If you're under the age of 18, there are certain things that you can't access, that you simply cannot do. There are developmental milestones that you're experiencing that make you more vulnerable as well. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Simply being a young person puts a youth at risk for exploitation, any youth. It doesn't matter their socioeconomic background, who their parents are. Traffickers are very savvy and they like a challenge, to be quite frank with you, and will target any child regardless of sort of what their background is. However, there are some additional risk factors that put youth at risk, and we see those risk factors listed here on the slide. So here are some additional vulnerabilities for recruitment. Children may desire attention. They may feel insecure or unaccepted and misunderstood. There may be consistent fights and arguments with their parents, so they're seeking that acceptance outside of the home. There may be some unhealthy family patterns or even boundaries within the home. The youth may be experiencing homelessness, or it may even be a victim of bullying, as we saw with the video earlier with Sasha Ray. So youth sometimes run from abusive situations at home, and if kids don't feel like they belong at home or feel accepted in their schools or in their communities, they'll seek to find that sort of sense of belonging and acceptance elsewhere. And when we think about our LGBTQIA+ youth, if their families are not supportive or they're thrown out of the home, they are typically more at risk of sort of exploitation as well, or even engaging in survival sex. In most of these situations, they're not reported as missing. So that's another issue and barrier we run into. And once they're on the streets, they're forced to trade sexual acts to meet some of those basic needs that we talked about earlier. Additionally, any involvement in the child welfare or juvenile justice system can also be a risk factor for exploitation. Exploiters will strategically target vulnerable youth, especially those in the foster care system, given their histories of violence, trauma, or neglect, and they often lack some basic necessities. Traffickers have written books about manipulating victims, looking for kids that appear lost, alone, don't make eye contact. Traffickers will also frequent group homes, MARTA stations, shelters, schools, basically anywhere where young people congregate. And one of the youth that we serve said that she was picked up outside of juvenile court by her trafficker. And so it just shows you how easy it is for these traffickers to access our young people. All right, so let's look at the social ecological perspective to this issue. So it's so easy for us to parent blame or say, you know, it's just these parents not paying attention, not taking care of their kids, but we're going to look at it from more of a public health standpoint. So we have the social ecological model listed here as a reference. And as mentioned, all children have some form of vulnerability, right? Some are temporary, some are personal feelings or struggles, some are a part of our communities and environment. But this image illustrates the complex interaction and interplay between individual, relationship, community, and societal factors that place children at risk of CSEC. So this model suggests that in order to prevent violence, any form of violence, but especially CSEC, it is necessary to act across multiple levels of the model at the same time. So the individual level, it identifies any biological and personal history factors that increase someone's likelihood of becoming a victim or perpetrator of violence. The interpersonal level examines close relationships that may increase the risk of experiencing violence or perpetrating it. And then the community level looks at settings such as schools, work, neighborhoods in which social relationships occur. And it basically seeks to understand or identify characteristics of these settings that are associated with becoming victims or perpetrators of violence. And lastly, the societal level, which is really that overarching level, looks at the broad societal factors that help create a climate in which violence is encouraged. So as you can see here, these risk factors can build on top of one another. And we share this image because it's so easy to place blame on the individual child, on their family, or even on their community. But when we look at the bigger picture, we see that this issue is so much bigger than a kid acting out or a parent not paying attention to their kid. And so we can think of all of the various examples, even in our own work, of how certain children are just at greater risk because of the different factors that are sort of at play in that child's life. So we're going to jump over to another video that just gives you an idea of how individuals in the sex industry or that are in some type of commercial sex work think, and how they target youth that are possibly at risk, or even adults that are at risk for commercial sex work. So we'll go ahead and show this video here that's produced by Adults Saving Kids.
A lot of what we would do is, as a management team, would be, you could play your good guy, bad guy routine and literally change people from being a waitress into a dancer. By that, what you would do is wait until you see the girl with a new car, a new apartment, new furniture, and then tell her that she no longer has a job because you don't need waitresses. But yet, it's okay if you want to dance, plus you'll make more money. And you don't want to lose your new car. You don't want to lose all these people you're friends with now. So why wouldn't you dance? Another one is, you know, you can take them to dinner, explain to them that you're short on amateur contestants that night, that they don't have to take their clothes off. At least just get on stage, you need the extra body, and make them feel guilty for not doing it because you're their friend. They want to make you happy. They want to please you. Everybody in the whole world, and this includes the person who was brought up in a Christian home, this includes the person who was brought up with money, this includes the person who was brought up with no money. they want to feel needed. They want to feel wanted. What my job was to find out what made them feel, what made them want, and what I could fulfill of those needs in order to get them to do what I wanted them to do. A lot of what I would do is on a weekly basis, I would talk to every one of the people that worked for me, and I would keep it on tape, and I would review it to see if I was doing what needed to be done to keep that person towing the line. I would have mandatory meetings to where I would talk about such trivial things as how much toilet paper they could use, just in order to let them know that if you can't make a decision on how much toilet paper to use, how could you ever make a decision to leave? They became totally dependent on the club due to the hours that they would work. If they're working from 9 in the morning till 4 in the morning, or from noon till 4 in the morning, they no longer live in a culture that you and I live in. They live in a subculture and really don't exist and intertwine with any of the things that we see as reality. Their reality is totally different than ours. If the club was to go away, then their friends would be gone, their income would be gone, their personal life would be gone because they'd have no apartment, no car. Literally, if they did not have that club, they would have no life.
So this video was an interview with a convicted trafficker describing the different tactics that he used to manipulate his victims. So were there some tactics that stood out to you? If you would just like to share those in the chat, any tactics that stood out to you? One that always stands out to me is the toilet paper discussion, and how, he basically has a PhD in manipulation. He would have conversations around trivial acts, such as going to the restroom and choosing the toilet paper ratio to try to manipulate victims. So that one stood out to me. Someone said being their friend, quote unquote, women becoming dependent. Absolutely. So now that we know a little bit more about vulnerabilities and the complexities of CSEC, let's talk about how being involved in CSEC can impact an adolescent's growth and development. And thank you all so much for continuing to put in the chat some of those tactics, isolating them from the rest of society, making her feel needed. Absolutely. All right, so we love to sort of give a foundational knowledge of adolescent development, because as Tiffany shared earlier, the primary age of entry that we're seeing is 12. And our organization, the CSEC response team, serves kids up to the age of 17 and 18. So as mentioned earlier, 12 to 14 years old is that age of entry. And this is why a foundational understanding of adolescent development is really essential to our understanding, or us understanding, why it's difficult for a survivor to leave a CSEC situation. So adolescent brains experience a significant phase of growth and development that's comparable to that which occurs during early childhood. We love talking about birth to 5 and how that's an explosive developmental period for our early or our smaller kiddos, but our older kiddos are having that similar sort of growth and development. This period of development can begin as early as 10 years old and end as late as 24 years old. Until the age of 25, as their emotions inform decisions, it's common to see youth make impulsive decisions as they're seeking more instant gratification. And this rapid phase of development often leads to behaviors and tendencies that we as adults will often misinterpret or misunderstand. So many of the misinterpretations of some of the behavior exhibited by our youth may be a result of complex trauma, and it may be rooted in commercial sexual exploitation. So complex trauma refers to exposure to multiple severe traumatic events and the long-term impact of this exposure. And complex trauma can impact several facets of a child's life. It can impact attachments and relationships, the body and the brain, their emotional responses, behavior, thinking, learning, their self-concept and future orientation. Complex trauma for a victim of child sex trafficking or CSEC could include that child being sexually exploited, raped every single night, compounded with persistent physical assault and emotional abuse. And so when you think of all of that, you have a developing young person who's also experiencing or has been experiencing some form of complex trauma over their lifespan. You can see how difficult it would be for this child to grow and develop appropriately. So now let's take a look at two examples of how complex trauma can present in children who experience CSEC. So on the left-hand side here, we have Taylor. Taylor is a 13-year-old transgender male who was exploited by his mother between the ages of 7 and 10. Taylor's mother exchanged sex with Taylor for drugs. Taylor was often left at home alone without food or supervision. And Taylor responds by running away frequently, having suicidal ideation, and physically and verbally assaulting caregivers and other adults in authority. So at first glance, we may think of Taylor as a difficult kid. He has some challenges. He's hard to work with. We may be asking questions like what's wrong with him versus what happened to him. And so this is just one example of how not knowing the full story can continue to sort of harm a child and put them in a difficult situation. Next, we have Erica. Erica is a 17-year-old youth who's in foster care, and Erica is being sexually exploited by a local gang in the neighborhood where her foster mother lives. They use the money that they make from exploiting her to purchase resources for the gang like rent, food, cars, etc. And Erica's basically afraid to seek help because the gang has threatened her foster mother and friends. As a result, Erica experiences low self-esteem, problems with boundaries, and eating disturbances. So again, maybe her issues or challenges are not manifesting as severely as Taylor's, but there's still something going on with this youth, whereas at first glance, it may be sort of tossed off as, oh, she's just a kid kind of going through the motions of adolescence. She'll be fine. She'll get past it, instead of asking some of those deeper questions to see what's really going on with her. So being trauma informed really requires us to, one, change our language, as Tiffany mentioned earlier, not referring to kids as child prostitutes, making sure that we hold traffickers accountable by calling them traffickers, and then changing our questions from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And when you see a youth who is struggling, checking in with them and just being that constant support system for them. So Tiffany referred to the human trafficking power and control wheel a little bit earlier, but what we want to do now is take a look at why it can be so difficult for our youth to leave an exploitive situation, really difficult for any person, whether they're a youth or an adult, to leave an exploitive situation. And so what I want you to do is, if you want to come off mute or share in the chat, take a look at each of the individual spokes here and try to figure out how a trafficker may use coercion and threats to maintain control over a child, or intimidation, or even emotional abuse. If anyone wants to come off mute and share with us how a trafficker may use some of these different tactics to maintain control over a child. No, someone wants to do it. And you can share in the chat as well. I think I hear someone coming off mute.
Hi, Naeshia. Okay, so you said you wanted us to say that again, what you wanted us to do?
Sure. If you just want to choose one of the spokes in the power and control wheel, like intimidation or emotional abuse, and just talk to us about how you believe a trafficker would use that to maintain control over a child.
So I would say, so if we use the example of like a foster child, economic abuse is huge because they really don't have, depending upon the circumstances of the foster home, they don't have any economic resources. They only have whatever they're provided by the foster family. So it would be easy for a sex trafficker to try to use the fact that they can make money to coerce them into, to performing sex for money. It would be really easy if they bought them something, and so they would start to trust or think that this person really cares about them. Next thing you know, they're saying, well, hey, I need some money. I did some things for you. Now I need something from you. And boom, there you go. And they got them.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing. And is your name Shahida?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. And you're absolutely spot on. Economic abuse is one that oftentimes is overlooked, but our kids have needs and wants, right? And so if this person is swooping in and saying, I see you don't have the most updated cell phone, I can make sure you get that. And sometimes it starts off as a gift, but now there has to be some type of return or exchange for that gift, right? And so you're absolutely right, Ms. Shahida, that it starts off that way. Economic abuse is certainly one method that they use. So we use this power and control wheel to illustrate, of course, the methods used to maintain influence and control. And a common question that our team and Tiffany's team often receives is, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they call law enforcement? And please understand that asking such a question is harmful to the victim and to all victims, right? Each spoke on the power and control wheel illustrates methods traffickers use. And remember, we have this developing young person who may have experienced their own trauma. And so they're going through all of the motions of growing up, developing, and processing their trauma. And now you put them in this constant wheel or cycle of abuse, intimidation, coercion. It would be difficult for anyone to exit a situation like that, much less a developing young person.
And I think sometimes too, we forget that some of them end up loving these adults. They love them and they don't want to get them in trouble. They don't want them to get locked up. And so that's another thing. They love sometimes the people who are trafficking them and abusing them.
Yes, and is it Ms. Terica?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. Yes, you're absolutely right. So when we talk about the trauma bonding that happens, there's an emotional connection that our youth have, and they will tell you they love their trafficker. They want to see them do well in life. Some of our kids will say, I still don't blame him or her for what they did to me. And so there's certainly a emotional component that has to happen in terms of their healing journey to help them identify how that behavior and how the trafficker's actions were harmful. And trust me when I say it's a process. It does not happen overnight. And this is why oftentimes our kids are not running to law enforcement or, screaming that they need help, which is a common misconception that our kids are in chains and bonded and held against their will. That's rarely the case. So thank you for sharing that. And I see a few folks shared in the chat. We'll go ahead and move forward into just the current response, and then we'll address some of that closer to the end. So what's happening in Georgia? What are we doing in Georgia to address this issue? And so we're going to talk a little bit about why a collaborative response is so important, and we'll also cover what's being done currently to address exploitation in the state of Georgia. So the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia and our network of 51 child advocacy centers across the state have been providing services to victims of child sexual abuse, physical abuse, and more recently, sex trafficking since the 80s. And so these are some of the services that our child advocacy centers offer to their families to assist them in that journey towards healing. And so those services can include forensic interviews, where we have that non-leading interview of a child to allow them to give their side of the story, give their statement about any abuse or trafficking allegations. We also have the trauma-focused therapeutic modalities that are offered by many of our child advocacy centers. And some of our CACs have amazing programming, such as the Georgia Center for Child Advocacy, which is Tiffany's organization. They have several programs embedded in their child advocacy center to support CSEC victims in particular. So a lot of great work going on throughout the state. So as we take a look at what a multidisciplinary team approach is, we'll give you sort of the backstory of the CSEC response. So in October of 2020, the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia and our network of child advocacy centers were deemed a statewide response provider for child sex trafficking cases. So some of you may be familiar with the previous response agency. So the initiative was subsequently named the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children Response Team. And we use a CAC model, meaning our child advocacy centers are the foundation of our response so that our kids can receive services within their communities. And that's really important to us because before, sometimes it would be individuals from metro areas going into the community to provide services, or the youth having to go into metro to receive those services. So this helps to ensure that those services can be provided to the family and child within their community. And we do use a multidisciplinary approach where we have all of the various professionals you see listed here at the table, because to be quite frank with you, no one organization can own the issue of child sex trafficking. It requires all of us at the table. DFACS can't carry it alone. Law enforcement can't carry it alone. And of course, our organization cannot carry this issue alone. And quite frankly, we need our community members at the table as well. And so Georgia has 51 child advocacy centers, and these centers collaborate with these multidisciplinary team professionals and the state CSEC response team to assess youth for CSEC, support them, and advocate for them as they go along their healing journey. So you're probably wondering, what should I do if I ever come across a kid that may be at risk of CSEC or I have concerns? And so the CACGA CSEC response team manages a 24/7 hotline for commercially sexually exploited youth. And this hotline, again, operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We provide, the hotline provides referrals, victim assistance, and information to law enforcement regarding the safe rescue of victims. And our hotline operators also assist callers in coordinating emergency services for youth. Under Georgia law, professionals and volunteers that work with kids are required to make a report if they suspect or witness any child abuse or CSEC. And so due to the complex nature of CSEC, it really requires us to make reports to the following entities. Of course, DFACS, the Division of Family and Children Services, our organization, the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia, and then law enforcement. And I'll tell you why. When we miss making a report to law enforcement, it requires our organization to go back in and make information or make a report with secondhand or third-hand information. Law enforcement typically prefers to have that information firsthand. Additionally, CSEC is a form of child sexual abuse in the state of Georgia. So DFACS also needs to be informed on any suspicions that you may have. And so we have the various hotlines listed here. You have the DFACS reporting hotline, our 1-866-NHTGA hotline, which is a phone tree. So you can access child services as well as adult services. And of course, 911 if you need access to local law enforcement. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Tiffany Sawyer to discuss prevention and how we can all be a part of that conversation.
Thanks, Naeshia. Okay, so I am going to very quickly take us through the last few slides. We may be just a few minutes over, so I hope you'll stay with us. So we've talked about, what human trafficking is, where it occurs, that deep and lasting impact that it has, how to report sex trafficking. And now I want to take us through some prevention tips and things that you can do and how to recognize signs. So we mentioned earlier, child sexual abuse is a root cause of CSEC. 80 to 90% of children who are trafficked have also experienced sexual abuse at home. So therefore, if we want to prevent CSEC, we must also address child sexual abuse and make sure that we are educating adults about that. So examples of things that we can do to be comprehensive in terms of strategies is, first, providing parents and caregivers with information about the facts and signs of child sexual abuse and the link between sexual abuse and CSEC, and make sure that there is a clear understanding that makes children extremely vulnerable to CSEC if they've experienced sexual abuse at home. We want to encourage parents and caregivers to talk with children about sexual abuse, what it is, what it looks like, to make sure that they are having conversations about being safe themselves, the proper names for body parts, what to do if something should happen to them, and the importance of recognizing the value and privacy of their bodies and that they have autonomy over their bodies and talking to them about consent. We want to also promote prevention programs in schools. So you may or may not be aware, but Aaron's Law was passed in Georgia in 2018, which requires sexual abuse and exploitation prevention programs in schools grades kindergarten through 9th grade. It is a requirement every single year, kindergarten through 9th grade. We also more recently had a human trafficking bill that was passed, which requires children to learn about human trafficking in grades 6th through 12th grade. And our organization is working with CACGA and Prevent Child Abuse Georgia and a ton of other organizations, Department of Education, to update a guide to provide good information about what programming is best practice and what are proven to be effective for students in schools so that schools can choose the right programming. We also want to insist that youth-serving organizations that are involved with youth have strong reporting policies and a staff code of conduct, because a lot of sexual abuse happens within organizations. So again, if we can decrease sexual abuse, we can also decrease a child's vulnerability to CSEC. And lastly, encouraging businesses to have codes of conduct that demonstrate zero tolerance for exploitation and activities surrounding the industry of sexual exploitation, like prohibiting business meetings at places like strip clubs or any kind of adult entertainment industry. Here are some red flags that we want to make sure that you are aware of. So knowing the indicators of exploitation and trafficking are really important. So a youth may exhibit one or more of these signs, things like, running away, experiencing homelessness, being involved in a gang, having tattoos that children are reluctant to explain, or things that seem more like branding, injuries that might be signs of physical abuse, not having access to basic needs, or having a high number of suspected sexual partners, not being in control of their own money or their belongings, like ID cards, a cell phone. They may have 2 cell phones. That would be a huge red flag. Lying about their age, false identification, dramatic personality changes. So those behavior changes are really important. You may also see signs of things that might occur through social media or online apps. So children having dating apps or money transferring apps means that they are extremely high risk, because they might have a ton of followers. So example, Snapchat. I am not on Snapchat, but if a child has a score of over 100,000, that could be a red flag that that they might, be being contacted by lots of people through Snapchat and other kinds of apps. There's an organization called Love 146. They have lots of really useful resources to learn about some of those questionable apps, or ways to monitor digital use, some keywords, some symbols, things like that to look out for. So www.love146.org, great organization to provide resources for you guys. Remember that no one sign proves that exploitation is present, but seeing multiple indicators together or repeatedly, or if stories don't match up, those are the kinds of things that we want to look for and ask questions. Do not be afraid to ask questions when you see some of these signs together. We also, one of the biggest things that you can do as a preventative measure is to help children develop a safety plan. That's one of the best ways that we can keep kids safe. A safety plan is personalized. It's a practical plan that youth can use to avoid dangerous situations and learn how they might react if they find themselves in a situation. So these are just some examples of, talking to a child, and it doesn't have to be your own child. It could be youth that you're serving. What would you do if someone asked to meet you, you met online, they asked to meet you in real life? What would you do? What would your response be? And helping them think through logically what they would do. You texted nude pictures of yourself to a friend and they shared those pictures with others at school. What would you do? What is your next step? So talking through some of those examples with children and helping them identify a safety plan. Here's the person I would call. Here's how I would respond. This is what would make me uncomfortable and would make me want to tell someone else. Those kinds of scenarios are really going to help kids, and to also help them understand this is not your fault. Someone has decided to violate your trust and they are in the wrong. So helping them understand that no matter what situation they've gotten themselves into, it really isn't their fault because they're a child. So it's really difficult to make healthy decisions in the moment. So by having this safety plan can really help you stay safe. Lastly, we want to make sure that we are learning as much as we can, taking additional trainings on child sexual abuse and CSEC prevention. are really helpful to help you all learn more, talking to youth as much as possible about some of these topics: body safety, sex and sexual abuse, healthy versus unhealthy relationships, consent, social media, being safe online, and how to seek help. Those are the best things that we can do to talk to kids to empower themselves. We want to invest our time, volunteer support, donate to anti-trafficking efforts and organizations in your community, and we want you to take action. So we hope that you have learned a lot today, and you can think of right now, as you're listening, think of one action step that you can take right now or in the next few days or next few weeks to help prevent or intervene in human trafficking, and particularly CSEC. So thank you so much for participating in today's training and for your thoughtful participation in some of the discussions and the chat. I appreciate your willingness to continue this conversation about CSEC, to learn more how it impacts children in our community. I apologize for going over by 5 minutes. I'm excited to see so many people staying on